about Sukkah, and there's a lot to talk about Sukkah, but I'd like to focus on one concept which I think is very intriguing, especially when you understand it in depth, and that is, in the building of the Sukkah, there are strange concepts and laws which are almost defy human logic. And yet, not only are they one or two, but they're numerous, and they all seem to be associated with the building of the Sukkah. For example, there's a concept which is in Sukkah called gut asik, which is where a person, if they're building a wall, could actually imagine that the wall is higher, or the other way, it might be a wall which doesn't come down to the ground, but they are allowed to imagine the wall. I mean, how do you make imaginary walls? There's also a concept of dofen akuma, which is if that the relationship between the wall and the sukkah doesn't really corner out the way it's supposed to, you are allowed to imagine that this wall is somehow miraculously leaning and therefore is part and parcel with the roof. And then there are other laws. There's a law called lavud. Lavud is an idea that if you actually have pillars within a certain distance, you can imagine that this area is a closed area. In fact, I'll tell you a personal story. When I was in yeshiva, we were up on the 4th floor. We had a window that had a little bar there, which was actually just these kind of bars. And as we're learning this about lavud, I took a piece of paper, crumpled it up, and tossed it out the window. And the Rebbe was horrified. He says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I wanted to see it bounce back off the lavud." But so here are these concepts which are very difficult to understand, and yet halachically, from a legal point of view, they actually create a sukkah. So there's something magical about the sukkah walls. And the Belzer Rebbe brings an incredible medrash about a house that God wants to build where God can live in. Now we know that when we talk about the house that God lives in, initially it was known as the tabernacle, the Mishkan. Later it became known as the temple, the first temple, second temple, and God willing soon the third temple. So when God wanted to build this, God built it by first putting up the first wall. And the first wall was called Machne, was called the camp. Machne Yisrael, that God would use the Jewish people as the first wall in building this structure. The next person who came along, or the first person who came along to build that structure on behalf of that, is God's agent called Abraham. Abraham, the Medrash says, adds the next wall, and the next wall is called Har, which is mountain. Yitzchak comes along and he adds the third wall, which is called Sodeh, the field. And finally, the fourth wall goes up, and that is called Yaakov, who comes along and adds the fourth wall called Bayit. Now, each one of these three words, mountain, Har, Sodeh, field, and house, Bayit, are the three words that are associated with each of these avot in terms of when they prayed on the Temple Mount. This was when they were in Jerusalem praying at the Temple Mount, this is what they brought. And when we do a careful analysis of these three words, we discover the three aspects of walls. Walls have three different functions. One wall is to be able to designate an area between one space and another. Another function of a wall is to protect. And a third function of a wall is to create privacy. So therefore, if the function of your wall is merely to delegate an area, you can make a wall with a string, like we do when we build an eruv. Its only function as a wall is to show this area as opposed to that area. If you want to make a wall where the function is privacy, you can use a sheet, because the sheet will now become a mechitza, let's say, a separation between men and women, possibly during prayer, but it doesn't have to be something which is strong, and it's not just simply a string, because it simply blocks the ability to see from one area to the other. And then the third function is something which is strong, and that could be a glass wall. So therefore you can still see through it, but you can't get through it like a bulletproof window, and that's the concept of a har. A mountain represents the concept of power, of strength. Sodeh, a field, is a designated area, and a house creates privacy. So these three concepts are the concepts of the way that a Kadosh Baruch Hu encloses and puts a wall around to build the temple. And as we know, the temple is really the metaphor for the sukkah. That's when we say, Harachaman, may God reestablish the sukkah of the fallen Sukkah of David. This is our prayer, that these walls should combine and build a home for God that will last forever as the third temple.